For those of you who've joined, it's great to see you all, and we'll start very, very shortly. We've got various people in the lobby being accessed as we speak. Great, well, welcome all. I make it 1:30. I'm sure others will join as we're going along. We're also recording this, so numbers will tick up, and then others can see it in their absence. So welcome. I'm Nigel Wilcock. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Economic Development. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk about, well, what's nearly the first 100 days in government of the new Labour government, and just reflect on changes. I'm sat here with Tom Stannard, Kieran Gunn-Jones, Katie Randall, and Dan Harper, who will all introduce themselves in a moment. We're going to go through a series of sort of top of the head observations on different aspects of the first 100 days, and then open it up to a Q&A session. But before we do that, I did just want to mention the iED's annual conference and awards dinner, which is on the 6th of November. For any of you who haven't yet signed up, well, there's still time to do so, although time is running out. And we do hope to see as many people as possible there. We've got a good lineup looking at urban and rural issues, regional and local issues, business and community approaches. And then we've got aspects such as higher education, culture and investment to consider. So it promises to be a pretty wide-ranging view, also to reflect on what we're here to talk about today, which is the first 100 days in government. So first of all, we'll do intros, and then I'll ask for sort of five or so minutes of observations. But let's start in terms of intros with you, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. Lovely to see those of you who I can see on one page of my screen, at least today. I'm Tom. I'm by day Chief Exec at Salford City Council, and by night numerous things, including Chair of the iED, an economic development practitioner by trade, amongst other things. So real pleasure to be involved in iED as a membership body representing all of you, and many thanks to Nigel for getting the plug for our conference and events out of the way. Do sign up if you haven't done so already. Look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Nigel.
Thanks, Tom. Kieran?
Thanks, Nigel. Good afternoon, everybody. Kieran Jones, Senior Director and Head of Economics at Litchfield's, Planning and Economics Consultants.
Katie?
Hi everyone, my name is Katie Randall. I'm an Associate Director with Arup, and I lead the City Economics and Strategy team.
Thanks, Katie. And then Daniel.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's good to see so many on the call. My name's Dan Harper. I'm the Head of Economic Development at Barnsley Council. And whilst I can't make the conference this year, I would recommend it. It's really a good conference to go to.
Thanks, Dan. Checks in the post. So we've got a great opportunity with two people representing local government, two people representing leading consulting firms in the field. So a good opportunity to reflect on, well, what was a bit of a surprise election when it came along a little earlier than we all expected, but we've had 100 or nearly 100 days of it now. And I was going to start by getting Tom's initial views on what's happened so far, what we're expecting to see. So, Tom, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. And it has been a kind of slightly wild and interesting time since the general election back in July. And that's not only a reflection on those of us who've had to run and manage the kind of administrative side of more elections in quick succession than we ever imagined we would have to. And I think what we want to try and do today is really focus on some of the bigger picture issues for economic development as a profession. So notwithstanding some of the kind of initial controversial issues that governments had to grapple with personnel and the benefit cap and winter fuel payments and so on. I think what's been really refreshing on a couple of levels has been the policy framework for growth and for focusing on what I think all of us who are, whether we're public sector or private sector members of iED would see as the kind of mission critical stuff to actually deliver growth in practice. And secondly, I think there is a real kind of sense of momentum and perhaps sort of porosity really in government engagement that has certainly changed a gear, if not a number of gears since July. And I think that's a real positive because, from my city role, from my regional role, from the work we do through iED nationally and more, and I'm sure that other colleagues will reflect on this as well. We've seen a real appetite from ministers, junior ministers, ministerial advisors, and from the civil service generally to really talk with and engage with the sector about how to get things done. And given that we are in iED in the business of practice and adding value to practical delivery, I think that kind of sense of dialogue and appetite for dialogue is a real positive. There's obviously, top of our list really in iED is economic growth, economic development, and the delivery of that. The first of the government's 5 big missions is to kickstart economic growth. And what I would welcome in the conversation today and reflections is really a bit of emphasis on that word kickstart, because there are so many things that can assist the profession in that respect. There are so many things that we have spent a long time trying to unblock to get schemes started, to get investors in, to get businesses growing, to get our labour markets better connected at local level. That I think the emphasis on wanting to do that kickstart in practice is really, really powerful, really important. Couple of areas that I think are just perhaps worth highlighting from my perspective, Nigel, that have been promising so far. Housing and planning. I know Kieran and other colleagues will perhaps talk a bit more about this in detail, but I think the planning reforms and particularly the emphasis on returning to national house building targets is a welcome thing. I think that is the kind of policy impetus that we needed. I guess the caution from my perspective is just, partly because in my region we represent an area where there is immense geographic sensitivity to land values and so on, that actually we've got to fix the impetus for supply as well as the national targets that determine the goals we want to achieve on housing delivery. So housing supply, I think, liberating Homes England and putting in place some intervention that really starts to see housing as a massively important part of social and economic infrastructure in the same way as we're having those debates about transport and connectivity, obviously. We're, I suppose, perhaps encouraged by, I think, some of the things that are starting to emanate from government ahead of the spending review about the possibilities for freeing up greater headroom for government on the capital side. And I think I would just be encouraging that thought process to continue beyond the kind of hard infrastructure. We've heard the stuff about the Euston Station a lot and so on in the press recently, but I think really important to focus on transport and housing as social infrastructure. And in all the planning reforms, I think we're still left with some rather imperfect tools, frankly, in SIL and 106 and so on in their current forms, which just aren't equipped to deliver that level of social infrastructure that we need at scale up and down the country. I think there's also some important things, and we called, remember, in our manifesto before the election as iED for reforms to the labour market and to skills and the economic mobility of people, as well as the infrastructure and commercial residential space and so on in the growth agenda. some encouraging early signs from Liz Kendall at Department for Work and Pensions, which has attached itself pretty closely to our Live Well wider determinants of health and employability of residents in my part of the world in the day job. And I think that sense of, an appetite for potentially contemplating some more radical devolution and/or public service reform in and around Job Centre Plus, Department for Work and Pensions and Employment Support, connected very much to what Bridget Phillipson has also been saying from DFE about curriculum reform. And I do think that's important because we've talked about the skills needs of our profession as well as the wider skills needs in the economy, very much needing that flexible curriculum, bite-sized learning opportunities, adult and lifelong learning opportunities to be built in. So I think there's a lot still to bring together in that DWP and Department for Education space, but again, some early promising signs. The final thing, which is very much a local government concern, is obviously sustainability of local government finance and the ability of particularly larger unitary Met authorities in urban areas to have the capacity to intervene and invest and really kind of drive and gear economic growth at a local level. I think obviously the capital and infrastructure considerations are key in that. There's a big open debate about devolution, which we're going to get into in a bit more depth. But Jim McMahon, who's a very kind of seasoned, ex-local, one of many actually ex-local government figures who's now in a fairly significant position in local government, said at the Labour conference this year that money should be going to the right places as part of his speech. And I think there is a sense there that even if it doesn't happen in the spending review this autumn, when we get into that possibility of next year and the year after moving to medium-term funding settlements for local government, that review of the methodology that I think starts to pitch to deprivation much more obviously, and particularly therefore to those areas of the country where there is that kind of hypersensitivity about land value differentials that often makes the viability conundrum so acute for many of us in a practitioner sense, I think are promising signs. And without a kind of definite commitment at the end of that, I think, again, back to my earlier point, Nigel, it's a promising sign that government wants to engage on those issues that have been troubling the local government sector and by extension many parts of our profession in ED for some time. So lots more to say, lots more to go at. I haven't even mentioned the NHS, but that is related to all of this, by the way. So if we get into NHS reform as well as part of the conversation, that will be deeply exciting. Look forward to others' contributions and hopefully contributing a bit to the Q&A, but I hope that's helpful as a start for 10.
That's great, Tom. Thank you. And it always becomes apparent when you start to talk about stuff like this that we bring in DWP and the Department of Education, you realise the breadth of economic development. But you picked up on two themes, planning in particular and devolution, and that's helpful because that's what Kieran and Katie are going to pick up and run with. So Kieran, on terms of your views of the government more generally and then planning and the work that you do at Lichfield.
Thanks, Nigel. Well, I think I'd echo Tom's comments to start with. My just general observation is that it feels like within the last nearly 100 days or so, we've seen more policy activity, announcements, things happening that really contrast very starkly now, looking back with what I think many of us felt was quite a long hiatus under the previous administration, where many things were simply not really being determined, were not being resolved, and funding commitments that were being announced weren't necessarily being kind of made. And all of that, certainly for many of our clients, added up to a lot of uncertainty. And I think that uncertainty was just another layer on top of all the other things that were going on in the macro economy and so on, that made doing things just feel very difficult, and many schemes were stalled as a consequence of that, and many investments were held back as a consequence of that. So I think we would welcome the fact that at least now we are, the future direction of travel is starting to become clearer. And, as Tom mentioned, there's still lots of unanswered questions, known unknowns, if you like. And, we're a few weeks away from a budget, which is going to be, I think, really important in determining the tone of what's ahead. But just, we are now in a very different place, perhaps, than we were or felt like the holding position that we were in until very recently. Now, you mentioned planning. Planning was actually one of the areas that Labour unashamedly said they wanted to focus on in the first 100 days. They were very clear about that. Now, they wouldn't be the first new administration to say they wanted to focus on planning. Those of us who've been doing this a while might remember, for example, back in 2010, the coalition government very much said, planning's a drag anchor for growth. Let's get stuck into it. So why perhaps were Labour keen to get to sort of focus on planning in their early part of their activity? I think there's probably two main reasons for that. The first is that actually getting development happening, getting investment in infrastructure happening is actually one of the few levers that the government ultimately has at the moment in terms of that sort of mission critical role of getting or kickstarting economic growth. When you look at the broader funding envelope, whether it's before the budget or after the budget, when you look at all the other constraints that this administration faces, actually just achieving private sector investment in development activity is going to be a critical part of that initial sort of stimulus to economic activity. But also, I think, to be fair, it's been a very challenging few years for the planning system. So, many local authorities have really struggled in terms of capacity and resource to dedicate to planning activities, and that's been in the context of cuts that have been made over time. Local plan coverage across the country has proved very difficult to achieve, particularly in terms of up-to-date plans. I mean, some estimates are that at the current rate, we'd only achieve about 25% local plan coverage across the country by next year, if nothing kind of changes. And it's all been met with a big shortfall in permissions coming forward in the places that really need that particular housing and economic development activity to take place. And of course, the development economics haven't been straightforward for all of the reasons to do with cost inflation, construction sector issues, and of course, the sort of viability challenges that Tom was alluding to. So when you put the need for growth and the ability of planning to have a role in achieving that, and hopefully achieving that quickly, and the need to remedy some of the sort of systemic problems that have started to kind of build up in the planning system in recent years, you can sort of see really why I think this administration felt they needed to get in quickly and early into the planning sphere. And I think that's important because, of course, they've got a very busy policy agenda with many competing pressures. So it's been good, I think, to see that take place. And I think, Matthew Pennycook has said that, the shortage of planners across the country is one of the things that keeps him awake at night. So it's very high up the kind of political radar. And I think that's, something that I think we would all particularly welcome. Now, in terms of the detail of what's come out so far on planning and its role in stimulating economic growth, I mean, that's probably a webinar, dare I say, in itself. But just to pick out, I guess, a couple of the key themes around what seems to be different or is looking like it will be different. I think the first of those seems to me to be the genuine cross-departmental interest in planning and making planning work better. So we've got number 10 working closely with Treasury and now the renamed or back to the old name MHCLG. And I think we haven't seen that in planning for a while. That's really critical if planning is going to firstly be part of the solution to delivering a new industrial strategy, for example, if it's going to be about the role that planning and planning powers have in the devolution agenda in different parts of the country, or indeed if it's going to be staking its claim on, funding going forward. So to see that cross-departmental approach to planning, I think is something that is really coming out very strongly. And, Tom talked about ministers open for those discussions. I think that open door approach from those different departments is something that perhaps hasn't been seen for a while. I guess the second theme is around what we know about sort of emerging policy reform more specifically. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the proposed changes to the National Planning Policy Framework. I'm not going to say too much in detail about those. I think some might say they are very much about housing, and I think that is true. But we shouldn't understate the impact that the reintroduction of mandatory housing targets may have. Perhaps we'll come on to that later in discussion. But it isn't. I don't think it isn't just about housing. There's some welcome new emphasis given to planning for the modern economy, so gigafactories, data centres, all of these things. It's the first time those terms have appeared in a planning policy document, or ever, to be honest. So the fact that government is starting to kind of put that economic and future industrial strategy thinking into planning policy, I think is a really important step forward, and again hasn't been seen for a while. I think the third theme I would touch upon is there is now perhaps the suggestion around the rediscovery of the value of strategic planning. So this administration is clear that whether it's looking at combined authority areas, whether it's looking at functional economic areas, it very much sees the return of a strategic planning level. And we'll all be familiar with the debates in recent years between sort of development needs being met across different geographies, and sometimes that process not going as smoothly as we would want it to. But if we're going to deal with some of the more challenging aspects of infrastructure delivery, planning for economic regions, that feels like it must be part of the solution. So I think we would particularly welcome the return of that, albeit we need to see the detail of how that might transpire. The fourth theme, I think, is perhaps just to say something around the new towns agenda. You know, Labour had indicated this is where they would want to go with it. We've got a task force established, and I think actually a really exciting opportunity around how those can be used to sort of kickstart development, accepting, of course, that the lead-in time for doing those things is often long. But we know from many examples in the past, such as Milton Keynes and so on, when you take that long-term planning approach around new settlements, you can achieve very successful new town and city economies, and that feels like it's something that should be part of the solution. And Michael Lyons has already said, you know, he very much sees new towns as having an economic role as much and as well alongside a housing delivery role. And then I think last but not least, touching on the sort of capacity and resource issues, you know, announcements have been made around the sort of planning super squad is the term, looking at how, you know, in certain parts of the countries where additional resource is needed, how that can be best deployed, accepting that these are, you know, planning for, well, the planning system full stop, but also planning for the economy and doing it quickly is something that's going to take a lot of more sort of time, expertise and capacity. There's probably more to do, I suspect, and that many would say that what's been announced so far probably won't go far enough. But I think the fact that it's part of these early proposals for driving forward the system, you know, again, should be welcome. So I think the final takeaway I would say is, you know, what's the outturn of this sort of change in the tone? I think it is now starting to trickle through to sort of private sector interest being reactivated, greater certainty about where we're headed. And in the short term, I think we're going to have to be quite pragmatic and practical about it, particularly if we want to get growth happening quickly. But in the long term, that then needs to be matched with, you know, solid policy reform, putting the right legislation in place, and of course, as Tom mentioned, getting those medium to longer term financial settlements in place.
Thanks very much, Kieran. Yeah, I think it is a bit clearer now, the direction that is going to be taken in a number of these areas. And as you say, the challenges are in the delivery, and I'm sure we'll have many of the people on this call pick up on that. And just before Katie steps in, we've now heard from two of our speakers. There's more than 100 people on this call. We're going to take our question and answer activity through the Q&A button on the Teams website that we're all sat on. So we won't be using chat, and we won't be opening up for people to speak. So now is the time to start to think about the questions and to start to populate the Q&A. So, but don't do that and take your eye off Katie, who is about to start and talk about, well, her thoughts in general, but also I think to touch on devolution. So Katie, over to you.
Thanks, Nigel. I think the first thing to say is to echo somewhat what Tom and Kieran have already said, in that we've seen some really positive overtures and noises in this space compared to where we have perhaps been in recent years. And I think from an economic development perspective, that's a really good thing. We're all obviously waiting for the outcome of the budget and the spending review at the end of the month, which will give us our best indicators of the priorities and what has come out as most critical for government in what is a long list of important things that they're looking to address. So in many ways, it's still a bit of a watch this space, but I think there's a couple of key reflections from me on the topic. The first is in relation to the Council of Nations and Regions, which is a fairly decisive indicator of the tone that government wants to strike moving forward. One of, more cross collaboration between devolved administrations, mayors, and central government, and the commentary from things like the Labour Party conference from the Combined Authority mayors have been responding really positively to government's openness to co-producing policy with them. We don't obviously know the governance of that council yet, but if it does provide, a new forum and a place to bring stakeholders together, then that isn't a bad thing. Decisions will be thought through more carefully, and the regional and local impacts of those decisions are likely to be better understood. So from a policy perspective, I think it's a really sensible move. And in my view, it's a good thing. If we're thinking about kind of devolution, we've obviously heard from the Minister for Local Government, Jim McMahon, of this big push towards devolution, and it was interesting and hopefully positive to hear comments about, wanting to stabilise local government finances in order to bring forward devolution. I think those things are linked. You don't want to be setting up devolution to fail. There was a really interesting map recently on the LGC, the Local Government Chronicle, that outlines the appetite for devolution locally across the country, and it's fairly clear that that there's going to be continue to be this push nationally, and we should be thinking about how to leverage it most usefully for our local areas. What I will say is that I think it's really good to see a conscious commitment, but it is difficult and it will take time. We still live in a very centralised country. It's not necessarily in government's DNA to centralise, and it's actually really ambitious to try to do it in the first term of power, when the natural inclination is to hold things close because you think that's how it will get done, and you need to show progress quite quickly. So I think Labour are going to have to try really hard to stick by that mantra and to drive it through. And when we're thinking about devolution, it's helpful to think of it in terms of both sort of breadth and depth of devolution. The messaging to date has very much been around increasing the breadth of devolution. So we've heard of the ambition for devolution to cover the entirety of England. And I think that is a kind of helpful conversation to be having, with the caveat that it has to be the right geographies, and that functional economic area is really important. But I think there's also a conversation about depth of devolution and how that might evolve. And I think that part is likely to be the more challenging part for Labour as they sort of move forward in the new government. Outside of London, I'd argue that combined authorities are hampered a bit by a lack of powers across, planning, economic development, housing, land, transport, and also lacking in the funding needed to really have an impact. So I do think there is a need for more holistic approaches which provide those functional geographies with both the powers and the funding to make real change. And that's the kind of depth element that I'm talking about. If we're thinking about the sort of local growth plans and the things that have the news that is coming out in relation to local growth plans, I think there is perhaps a little bit a tendency towards cynicism around local growth plans. We've been around the block with similar requirements before. Local industrial strategies were a little bit blink and you miss them. But I think they are really important, and they fundamentally come down to this question of the core drivers of why places exist. There's a lot of emphasis on housing in this government, and that's obviously important. We know we're in a housing crisis, but I think as economic development professionals, we need to sort of bang the drum and articulate the economic purpose of our places. People in new towns need jobs and employment as well. as Kieran's quite elegantly covered, there's this return to the sort of strategic planning approach, which I think on balance is a good thing. But this won't be a panacea to resolving approaches to growth at a wider geography, and it won't have an impact straight away. And I think this is where local growth plans are helpful. Those plans need to be led by quite a clear national strategy towards productivity, which is aligned also to the government's funding approaches and decisions as well. I think there's an interesting tension with these local growth plans and consider the purpose of them and how this purpose aligns with the geographic makeup of places. So if you're taking the purpose of the local growth plan is to improve growth and productivity, the core driver of a lot of that growth will be metropolitan or built up areas. And I think the tension there is to consider how we give the right emphasis on metropolitan versus rural areas, which comes back to being very clear on the exam question for our own local growth plans and how we address those sensitivities and the local context that's associated with them. As a sort of final thought from me, I suppose, I think ultimately, as economic development professionals, there's a real focus that we need to retain on getting things delivered on the ground. Policy is obviously still being shaped. My slightly perhaps optimistic view of these is that some of these things like the longer term settlements, the devolution, the local growth plans, they are looking to collectively clear the way to make it easier to get stuff delivered on the ground. I do think we need to be conscious that these changes are not happening in a vacuum. The signalling from government is it's going to be a very tough fiscal environment. So I think there's personally a real consideration about how we best get things delivered, and inevitably that's going to be, or is likely to be, far more partnership working, more emphasis on inward investment, and particularly leveraging sort of private investment.
Thanks, Katie. No, thanks very much. And to that point on depth of devolution, I was struck even this week, Local Government Chronicle talking about maybe some doubt over the trailblazer opportunities in Greater Manchester and the West Midlands. So I don't know whether that was just journalists flying a kite or whether there was some doubt there. But very pleased to see there are some questions emerging in the Q&A. Don't let me stop you doing that. But before we dive into those questions, well, Dan's got the unenviable task of now picking up what's remaining that hasn't been covered. But no, with a view to local government and seeing it from the perspective of being sat in Barnsley. So, Dan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. It's been, really interesting into the earlier speakers, and I agree with everything that's been said. Really, I suppose what I'll try and do is add sort of a local authority perspective, but in particular, sort of an economic development service delivery perspective to it on the ground, as it were. I mean, the first thing I would say though is I do agree that there's been some really positive mood music coming out regards economic development, devolution, etc., which has been touched on. Things like the deeper devolution that I was talking about, industrial strategy, local growth plans, everything that was in the King's speech, the stuff on planning we've been talking about, and the messaging that comes out of the mayors going down in week one of the new government, etc. So there's some positive stuff coming out. Inevitably, though, we need the detail on lots of these things. So local growth plans, there's a lot of work been going into those at an early stage, but it's still not clear exactly how they'll fit into everything and what's expected of them. Similarly, other positive stuff that coming out from a sort of regional perspective, although it does come with a bit of risk, is but positive noises around bus reform, things like that, proposed single settlements. So we'll see what comes out of those in a bit more detail, probably into the spring. But like I say, quite positive noises to date. I suppose touching on some of the areas we've been talking about on devolution, I suppose what I would say from a local government perspective is it's really important that alongside further devolution to MCAs, etc., it needs to come with repairing the foundations of local government, because without firmer financial footings for councils, we won't have the ability to support the MCAs in delivery. And obviously, councils are a key delivery partner for MCA. So I don't think one could come out of the other if it's going to have maximum impact and benefit to the regions. I think on local growth plans, there has been a lot of work going on in South Yorkshire, and obviously Barnsley's been involved in that. We've been asked for key themes and key constraints that will feed into the new national and digital strategy. Again, more to come on that really, and I think we won't see that much detail out of them really until early spring and the budget in early spring. But a lot of work been going on to date on the ground to feed into those and to feed into the autumn statement, what will come out in the autumn statement. So we'll see on those. But I suppose some of the impacts of, and again, these are inevitable impacts, and it's because of a change in government, it's always the way. But some of the impacts we've been seeing on the ground are things like the pausing or the reassessment of inherited growth funds. So, for example, the pausing or the suspending of the long-term plan for towns funding, that's causing sort of uncertainty in plans that are in place. When it was suspended, plans were very advanced for those towns that had that funding. So it's been difficult and challenging to pause that work at such a late stage without knowing what's coming, if anything, after, whether it'll be wrapped up in single settlements, etc. We don't know yet. So that's having a big impact on the ground. Other things that we've been impacted by, in South Yorkshire, we were the first MCA to be awarded the investment zone funding. So we've got year one funding, but we know no more after year one. So again, it's causing it's developing a bit of a vacuum, and everybody's waiting for the budget at the end of October to see what happens. So that's the key date really for everyone. But I suppose the other big area that's where the uncertainty lies is shared prosperity funding and the cliff edge of March 25. And I know there's lots of local authority colleagues on the call who will understand this. Just take Barnsley, for example. 85% of my team are funded by either capitalised or funded by external grants. So that uncertainty is challenging at this stage. So the sooner we know more about what will happen with these funding streams, the better. But having said that, we have had our final tranche of Future High Street funding this month, so they are paying out on some of the grant funding that we've been working on, so that's good. In terms of the planning stuff and the housing uplift, again, the ambition is great. Barnsley is a very ambitious council, and we'll do everything we can to support the government's ambitions to deliver more housing. I think our track record would demonstrate that. Having said that, 1.5 million homes in a parliament is ambitious. For Barnsley, in terms of housing numbers, it's an extra 31% increase in housing numbers on an already ambitious local plan. For Yorkshire as a whole, it's 47% increase. So challenging, but like I say, the first default for Barnsley will be we'll support this. We're ambitious. We'll try and help the government deliver this ambition. But it depends on so many factors, doesn't it? I mean, in terms of land supply, the developers' appetite to release there's not that many houses in such a short period of time. So there's a number of things that will impact on that. And I think reform of the planning, I mean, I'm no planner, but reform of the planning system, it isn't the silver bullet. Local authority planning capacity isn't the only issue in the planning system. Statutory consultees often take a long time to respond and cause delays. So there's all sorts of factors that need to address them before that many number of houses can be delivered, I think. But I think where we have had some really positive engagement with the new government in these last 100 or so days is around the opportunity to influence policy. So we at Barnsley have been doing a lot of work on what we call that Pathways to Work programme. So this is about inactivity rates, economic inactivity rates, and getting people back into work, and taking a holistic approach to that when the impact of health on people's inability to work, for example. So we've done a big piece of work around this. It was led by Alan Milburn, and Liz Kendall launched it I think it was back in July, so quite early on in the new government. So we've had some really good buy-in from government on policy development that hopefully get rolled out nationally. It's certainly going to be piloted in South Yorkshire, so we're really excited about So the government have been really engaging on these types of things and involving and working with local government on policy development. And it's not just the Pathways to Work programme, it's things like the Health on the High Street, which Tom referenced NHS, and I think they're key to a lot of this. So we're doing a big piece of work with the NHS to bring facilities into the town centre, which is obviously good for health outcomes and good for economic outcomes. So I think overall some really positive noises coming out of government. Yes, there's some uncertainty, but I think that's understandable given a change of government, particularly a change of colour in government over such a long period of time. So I think from our point of view, we just need to wait until October. I think that's what everybody's waiting on, October the 30th.
It is. I'm tempted to block out my diary for that day and and try and make sure I'm not on a Teams call when it's all happening. I'm also struck down. I mean, I completely agree about local government future funding. I mean, I think I don't know whether to cheer or cry when Michael Gove comes out and says that local government paid too high a price for austerity. Well, it's all very well saying that. Well, I suppose we'd all agree with that, but then he was in government at the time. So anyway, we just read these things in as they're reported. The first question to the panel, and everybody's touched on it to a greater or lesser extent. I don't know whether anybody really has got the answer to this until the budget, but we've got things like Shared Prosperity Fund that's been mentioned in our Q&A. We've also got free ports, investment zones. We've got whatever might or might not replace the Levelling Up Fund. And then we've got more generally local government funding. So anybody want to, is this just a case of waiting and seeing on the 30th of October and beyond, or anybody got any views as to the direction of travel? Anybody got any secrets they want to share at this moment?
Not really secrets, Nigel, at all. But I think what's important to remember is that we are the jury's still out, because a lot of those funds you've mentioned are the creations of this government's predecessors, aren't they? And we called in our manifesto, as did many other professional bodies like iED, for a reduction, if not a kind of strategic move away from spot funding and short-term funding and the kind of bidding mania warfare that goes on around, peddling the same scheme to 250 different funds that have all got uncertainty and ridiculous spend deadlines wrapped around them. And I think government is yet to take a kind of strategic view on how it rationalizes those, and particularly on things like, Dan's mentioned SPF, as have colleagues in the chat, which is a very important one. But if you think about some of the things that are actually driving different sector growth, and particularly supporting the innovation ecosystem and universities and so on, which is really, really important to lots of areas of the country, urban and rural, the innovation accelerators, the aspects of investment zones that are attached to that. What succeeds them is yet to be confirmed. So I think we have to keep up the pressure around that. I suppose the glimmer of light in it is that for me, Jonathan Reynolds has been engaging with us directly already about the likely industrial strategy green paper. I think it's green as opposed to white, that's due to come out in parallel with the spending review. And they're also talking about, the Industrial Strategy Council being, an entity with staff and a kind of body with capacity, in other words, to engage with. And I think those are positive signs that actually on something that's been high on our radar as ED professionals, and certainly as iED for some years now, the shift back to a more kind of considered view of industrial strategy and industrial policy from a national level, with a body behind it that is looking to kind of engage with the sector and take that debate seriously, I would think is hopefully a good sign, because I'm certain that any industrial strategy council worth its salt with capacity behind it and good people advising it would struggle to see the logic of continuing with the kind of spot funding mania that many ED professionals in both public and private sector have been racking their brains about for some time, quite honestly. So no great secrets in there, but again, I think some promise to come. I don't think the government has yet made a decision to say, you know, we either will or won't continue with each of those separate funds. I think the jury's still out, but, you know, let's, as iED, I'd say, continue with our endeavours to engage with the industrial strategy green paper. And, you know, absolutely, we should directly, indirectly, in whatever form, quite honestly, we should be at the table engaging with that once it gets up and running later in the year, I think.
Yeah, we've had a comment in from Ian Cruz asking whether the iED is lobbying in this area. And I think the important thing from an iED perspective was that Baroness Blake was our immediate past patron who's had to stand down because she's now in government. We'd engaged with Sharon Taylor, who's in government. So whatever the name is on the scheme, and they may change, certainly this importance of funding economic development activity has been central to what we've been trying to do. Any other thoughts on that from other panelists before we ask another question?
No, I was just glad agree with everything Tom said around the structure of these funds and how they are passed down and doing away with competitive bidding, etc. And I've got no secrets into this either, but my gut tells me there'll be a 1 year bridge for this, because everything I'm hearing about the single settlement is coming 26, 27. So it's what's happening 25, 26. And I think that's where the desperation to know is from economic development professionals is what's happening next year, because there's a huge cliff edge coming at March 25 for a number of these funding streams. So, and I know there's a lot of lobbying going on from a lot of different sources and interested parties, so including the mayors. So, you know, just hopeful that we'll get some clarity for next year before some wider thinking on the whole infrastructure of local growth funds from 26, 27 onwards.
Yeah,
I'd agree with that. I think a 1 year settlement seems like the most pragmatic way forward, and I think that's because genuinely, and it picks up the point that Tom made, I mean, this administration has now got to look at how it rationalises what has become a very complex patchwork of rounds of central programmes, some of which are spent, some of which are not spent, and so on and so forth. A jigsaw puzzle of sort of area-based initiatives, some of which still have funding associated with them, some of which don't. So that might be investment zones and free ports and so on and so forth. So you've got this incredibly complicated, or they've inherited this incredibly complicated landscape. And I think that creates a lot of challenge for well, anyone navigating it, to be honest. I think it makes it very difficult for local authorities to be able to plan properly around how they can best use those. But it's also incredibly confusing to the private sector and those who want to invest in different locations, because actually to understand what might be available or what initiatives are there to support what they want to do, you've got to go through quite, in some cases, a long almanac of different sorts of awards that have been made and so on and so forth. So I think, you know, it would be really nice if this administration could try and get there quickly on how they see the best fix for that. But I do feel that they will need the time, and I think it may well be in the long term that is the best way forward, is to have a sort of a 1 year settlement to tie things over, but then create the sort of time to allow the industrial strategy to come forward and to just to give that medium term view of how do we create a more sustainable, predictable and lower risk sort of system for this, because I think it seems to me that's the only way in the end that all of the challenges we've had are going to be faced with.
Yeah, and I think to that, and we've got other questions in the chat too. I think with the end of the LEPs, with the requirement for local growth plans, it does seem to me the time is right to say, well, economic development needs to be a statutory function, because otherwise, where does it lie? And how are you going to ensure that your local growth plans are completed effectively and then delivered? So we'll carry on pushing on that too. Clearly, that's been an absolute theme of the Institute over the last 12 months, but it isn't going away. We do have a question about those growth plans, though. It seems to me that growth plans are essential if you're going to have a framework against which you can sensibly put other policies. But do panel members have a view as to whether another round of growth plans is the right way to go? What do we think? I don't want to pick on anybody, but Dan, given you have obviously a role in a local authority, and you had a number of funding schemes in play, what's your thought about this at a local level?
Well, I mean, it does feel a bit like Groundhog Day, but I think Katie referenced the flash in the pan of local industrial strategy previously, and you know, a number of combined authorities have recently done economic growth strategies, as it were, in the last few years to then have to convert or align them with a local growth plan. But I think it's inevitable because you know, it's a new administration, new policies, and new levers will be introduced, etc. So I think it's inevitable. So I think we need to look at them positively and be involved in the process as much as possible and feed into the national industrial strategy, and that'll be overarching. So I think we have to look at them positively, feed into them, but crucially, I think it's what's the outcome of them? What does it unlock having a local growth plan, and what's the benefits of it practically from a devolution point of view? So I think that's the key thing for me is what will the local growth plan unlock, and what will its status be? I mean, the iED have done a lot of work on trying to enable economic development to be a statutory function. So, you know, if this is a mechanism to that as well, then I think that's positive, and I think we should engage with it and get the most out of them.
Nigel,
could I just see you quickly? You went off mute. Over to you.
Just to add on this as well. I mean, I think Dan's right. You've got to try and use this as a basis for positive engagement. If it's something that is ending up on the desk or the intro or whatever of the Industrial Strategy Council body, then I think it's there for the taking, really. I think what we've just got to be careful about is that we don't fall into traps of having a kind of reductionist approach to those local growth plans, because some of the some of the impetus and pressure has been about taking a very kind of reduced approach to saying which sector is your key growth sector, as opposed to which sectors and which areas of the local economy and which geographies are you seeking to support in which way. And obviously geography is key to this, as is the structure of your functioning economic area. But I think we've just got to be careful that we do give a kind of plurality of views that properly reflects where the private sector are at, where the universities are at. And in Greater Manchester, that is it's a relatively short list because there are some big players and big sectors in there, but it is a list. It's not a kind of single preference, and I think we've just got to be really careful about that. There are complementary sector strengths, for example, between Greater Manchester and West and South Yorkshire. That means actually some of the same things will be on our lists for very good reason, because there's an interplay between those sectors. I mean, media production, TV broadcast is just one case in point in that respect. So I think we've got to guard against any attempt to, almost badge particular regions with specialisms in a way that's artificial to the nature of the way that the regional economy actually works, and the interplay between regional economies, because that's really, really, really important. And as a wrapper for all of that, by the way, I think if any of us are writing local growth plans and we're outside of the Greater London area, we should be saying transport and infrastructure are blooming essential to delivering them. Just saying.
I think on that point, Tom, when you're looking at something like your major infrastructure, the local growth plan is obviously really important, and the individual plans are, but this is where that regional approach and making the case across different authorities becomes really important, because that's how you attract your large scale investment as well. And so when we're thinking about this local growth plan, your point around having these synergies or similar sectors in different regions is actually, it's not necessarily a bad thing if that is true for the region, and is something to be leaning into to grow that narrative.
So I was going to thank you, and I think I also feel a bit like Groundhog Day, but yeah, if you don't have a framework, what is the common thread for the future of your local economy? So moving on, we've had a number of, I'm going to try and link some of the questions together. So we've had commentary about, this is more planning, but the view at a local level compared to the top-down views of Whitehall, the views that some of the planning framework has been quite housing dominated, but actually we're really trying to focus on growth. The fact that there's a heck of a lot of consultees in a local plan, and we do obviously want to balance the hugely important question of the environment alongside local growth. And then are we allocating enough employment land? So I don't know whether I've made the question overly complicated, but I mean, I guess I'll look to Kieran, who kicked us off on the planning front, maybe to say a few words on that, and then just open it up more generally. So I hope I've not introduced too many threads to that question, Kieran. What any views?
Well, I'm not sure what I've unleashed, to be honest. But anyway, well, on planning, yeah. I mean, I think, on the high level point around, does it feel like a lot of the early work has been around housing? As I mentioned earlier, I think that's right. A lot of it is. Is there a useful additional emphasis on economic growth within the revised NPPF? Yes, there is. Does it go far enough? Possibly not. Could it have gone further? Possibly yes. And I think a number, you look at some of the representations that have been made to government on that now. It will be interesting to see how they respond to it. But I mean, how do you get more emphasis on it? It seems to me one of the obvious things is to have in place, a national industrial strategy that then can carry weight in terms of planning, plan making and planning decision taking, for example. At the moment. And I think that touching on the previous point around local industrial strategy and so on, I think it's really regrettable that there was a sort of hollowing out effectively in the end of that process. And what it meant was there was no real sort of national policy statement effectively that when you were, as a planner, looking at how do you sort of plan for these things and how do you grant consent to them, that you could actually reference. The related point is, when you consult on a planning application, there is no statutory response from anybody covering economic development. Yes, you may have, comments from that local authority's economic development officer, but not every authority necessarily has one. So that's why actually the statutory role of economic development, the iED has been calling for, becomes absolutely central. So that is, given parity, if you like, amongst some of the other considerations. And as I said, I think an external reference point around national strategy or indeed local growth plans would make a lot of sense. In terms of employment land, that's the age-old conundrum, I suppose, in many ways. And I think, this is something that has become incredibly difficult to realise properly and to deliver properly, particularly in terms of both viability challenges in some parts of the country, but also in terms of the competing pressures from housing. Is that going to remedy itself quickly? I don't think it will do. One of our suggestions was, for example, to national policy was to introduce a sort of 5-year rolling supply of employment land in every part of the country. That would start to give parity with the requirement for housing land supply, to ensure that actually areas had available and deliverable employment supply alongside new housing development. So that would be interesting to see whether that's an area where the government might choose to go. So I think, I think Daniel made the point earlier, planning is not the silver bullet, but actually it is something that if you can get it right, and introduce fairly quickly, there is no reason why it shouldn't really give those better conditions for development activity to come forward. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think we are starting to see some signs of the market responding to that, and that in the end is what we're going to need.
Thanks, Kieran. I don't know if anybody else wants to. Tom, are you?
Well, yeah, I think I mean, I agree with everything Kieran said as usual. I think he's hit the nail on the head, particularly in terms of how you think about the positioning of the plan making process to drive that kind of medium to long term sector led view on a regional basis. I think what's really striking though as well is if you take if we brought this back to the kind of brass tacks of the missions and the kickstarting economic growth, and obviously the kind of the political imperative about making some inroads in that this Parliament, because that is it's a kind of artificial cycle to economists, isn't it? But it is an important cycle for this. For my sins, I was at an event earlier this week with the RICS, and virtually all of the audience was private residential, actually, developers. And the vast majority of them, judging by the accents in the room, were from London and the Southeast as well. But what was interesting was, virtually all of them, without me even having to put my hand up and make the point, were saying planning is not the problem here. The planning departments are not the problem. The granting of permissions is not the problem. It's the oiling the wheels of getting things built out that's the difficulty. There's whatever the figure is, I think it's 1.5 million plus residential units with permission that are stuck in the system because of delivery wrangles, because of complexity about local authorities having to take forever negotiating 106s because 106 is such an imperfect tool for delivering extended infrastructure needs. And lo and behold, there are many thousands of those consented schemes that are virtually impossible to bring forward because of viability problems and marginal viability issues that are, then just make the kind of protracted negotiations around the residuals also drawn out. So I think the view from the private sector, in other words, and the residential sector is that, planning is a really important part of the long-term framework. But if you want to do the kickstarting, there needs to be some intervention at scale to overcome some of those problems so that actually we can get, what would kickstart things is getting a number of those consented schemes out of the ground, quite honestly, rather than thinking if all we do is get everybody subscribed to new national housing targets, that's somehow going to solve the problem or start to solve the problem this Parliament. Because, before any of this happens, 6 months of the first year of this Parliament has almost disappeared. And, I think there is some serious consideration there to be given to kind of oiling the wheels of stuff that's already consented and working with the private sector who understand that, yes, there are always planning department capacity issues, but it's not actually the granting of permissions in the short term that's the biggest problem the government faces on residential or commercial growth delivery. It's in a broad sweep of things, it's infrastructure and viability matters that are top of the list. And Nigel, colleagues, with enormous apologies, I'm going to have to disappear in just a couple of minutes because I've got a kind of 2:30-ish diary clash I've got to get to. But I will try and fade politely into the background in a second. But it's been a real pleasure to hopefully be part of the conversation with you all this afternoon. And don't forget, anyone who hasn't booked on our conference is not allowed to leave the call until they've done so, of course. But lovely to see you all and chat with you.
Thanks, Tom. And for everybody on this call, we obviously knew that Tom had only an hour for this call, but that doesn't mean we need to cut short the discussion. And to Tom's point, well, and to Kieran's point, I mean, certainly at the back of my mind around some of the planning reform activity, just the issue around the method of valuing land around residual land values after a change of use, and the way that really brings forward the value into the landowner and restricts development, I think is a big issue for us all, and I don't know whether that's ever going to get resolved. But let's leave planning to one side now. And there's been a number of comments in the chat that link to our intervention, government's intervention in industry and sectors. So we've had question about where do we think the EU might, the relations with the EU might go next. I think linked to that, there's a question about inward investment and to whether there's going to be a continued focus on trying to secure inward investment into the UK. And then this whole idea about, do we understand our sectors well enough, and can we actually stimulate upstream and downstream supply chain growth in different industries? So again, I've maybe tried to link too many questions together, but I don't know. I know, Katie, you were sort of talking about devolution and local growth and local growth plans, and that some of that at least is related to sectors and sector activity and what government does. As I say, unfair to pick on people, but do you have any initial thoughts on that area?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the question about inward investment and do we think we'll continue to see that as a priority? I think if we're thinking about the current fiscal environment, one where we're hearing messaging about things being tight and challenging budgets, I think the focus on inward investment is inevitable, particularly kind of large scale private investment. I think we're more likely to see increasing trends towards sort of public-private partnerships and how you can leverage those to develop and deliver major infrastructure for the country, because the message that we're receiving is that it will be challenging for a government to do that alone. So from that perspective, I think the focus is likely to continue, and it's a big part of a strategy designed to increase the growth and productivity for UK PLC. So I think that will remain at this stage. I think the stimulation that upstream and downstream is a big part. The kind of the sector response is a big part of the view of your local growth plans and how you are leveraging the specific elements for your local region. There are obviously going to be overlaps in those regions, and I know one of the criticisms perhaps of the local industrial strategies was that sometimes it felt like they were almost copy paste sometimes, and you could change the names and it wouldn't be different. And some of that is, I think, because it is difficult, but it's really important to be leaning into what it is that are the strengths of your specific area. And when we're developing those, it can be really hard as economic development professionals, because you kind of go, well, if such and such does want to invest here, we don't want to discourage them through the local growth plan, but actually recognizing the parts that are unique and specific benefits for your area are really, really important. Yeah, I think that's my key immediate reflections.
Yeah, and mine too, Katie. I mean, actually, inward investment and business support, business sector development was really how I came into economic development. So if as a chair I'm allowed to have a view, I'm not sure I am, but I will give one anyway, is I do think that, the iED's on record as saying that Brexit was not the choice that we'd have gone down as a profession. And I do think that Brexit has made the argument to invest in the UK to access a European market has obviously become slightly disconnected. But I do think that means we've got an opportunity to refocus our inward investment activity around R&D type activities, around non-physical goods, maybe around HQs, and all of that moves us up the value chain. So I don't think it's not a dead duck, but I am struck that inward investment does seem to have been the poor relation when compared to trade in DBT over the last 5 or so years, and we'll just see how that pans out. On the question of business investment, any Dan or Kieran, anything that you want to add? Because if not, we can move on, but I'm very happy to hear views. The EU question is way above my pay grade, so I'm going to avoid that one totally. But I think on an investment point of view, I think
there definitely will be a focus on it. There can't not be a focus on investment. So I think it's just how you do it. And I think there is a question in there about pan-regional partnerships. And I think inward investment is one of those areas, along with things like the strategic transport, where the North needs to work together. Clearly, there'll be a UK government approach to inward investment and attracting inward investment, but below that level, I think the North needs to work closely together. And it's back to Tom's point about not being reductive in terms of competing against other regions. When first and foremost, we need to attract them here to UK PLC, full stop. So I think it's one of those areas that'll be that northern mayors in particular will be working together on.
I think all I would add to what Katie and Daniel said, and you, Nigel. I mean, on the EU question again, I mean, who knows? I mean, I think though we've got to be realistic about what's likely to be achievable in the immediate years ahead. Let's put it that way. And going back to what the point that Tom was emphasising, this is about kickstarting things and kickstarting things, dare I say, relatively quickly. And whatever your view on Brexit and all the things that went around it, what we do know from all of that process is it's not a quick one. So whether it's how high up the list that will be in terms of this administration and what it wants to achieve, I think is probably debatable. I mean, on the inward investment point, I mean, I'd agree. It does feel like this is an area that has really struggled in recent years and not been given the kind of policy emphasis or support that it might have been. But the reality is, as we've heard many times, the UK has a productivity issue. It needs to find ways of increasing its productive capacity and getting on and doing that quickly as well. If that means importing new ideas, new businesses, new ways of working, or businesses that have links to international supply chains, I mean, it seems to me that it's critical that we are open to doing that and facilitating that. And without wishing to kind of keep dragging things back to planning, because planning is by no means the be all and end all, but one of the very subtle changes in the NPPF, missed by many actually, was a change, literally one word change, that said you have to plan for strategic employment sites. It wasn't a case of just criteria for them, it was actually make them available and plan for them. And that is one of the challenges we've often had, is actually when something lands and wants to go into a particular region, the system has often not been very good at accommodating it and dealing with it quickly, and we've often therefore lost out to other locations as a consequence of that. So I think it feels that it really will be incumbent on us all, whether it's through planning or whether it's through other initiatives, whether it might be on skills or whatever it could be, that actually we're going to have more of a focused eye on inward investment capacity, wherever that might be coming from.
Yeah, I'd agree, but Kieran, I think slightly concerned that Matthew Pennycook might not be the only one who's worrying about the number of planners keeping him up at night. But anyway, I agree, and I agree with the points on the EU conversation as well. It feels as though that's not really in our gift to answer. It might be that this is the final area of discussion. Certainly happy to take more questions if you have them, but we've got a question here about the role of national and regional government in business support and innovation, and I might add to that these early tests that the government has had around Grangemouth and Port Talbot, and to their willingness to intervene and the need to intervene, but we don't have to answer the Grangemouth and Port Talbot issue. What do panelists view in terms of the role of national and regional government in business support and innovation? And I know, Dan, because I know Barnsley and I know the work that your team has done, maybe sort of start with you and how you see business support activity on the ground and how you deliver change in that space.
Yeah. Well, I think as with most things, it's a mix. But I think with devolution, the way it's going, I think the default really should be that business support is delivered at a regional, local, regional level to accompany the powers that hopefully mayors and mayoral combined authorities will have or will get. So I think the default would be I'd like to see most of the provision provided at a regional level, the MCA level, notwithstanding the the two scenarios you mentioned earlier, then clearly there's a national response needed for things like that. But I look at the stuff in Teesside, what they're doing. Look at some of the stuff in South Yorkshire with the advanced manufacturing research centres and things like that the MCAs are all supporting, along with the universities, etc. So I think my default would be that I'd like to see it delivered and designed and delivered at a regional / local level. I think what's happened previous is that all these policies, like Shared Prosperity Fund, are pretty much designed at national level, and then the regions have to deliver them. Whereas I think hopefully going forward there'll be more of a co-design, or certainly more of a lead and design for these products and services from a regional level. That's what I'd like to see.
Yeah, and I think, again, the iED, sorry, Katie, I was just going to say the iED certainly has taken the view that devolution isn't about policies designed by Whitehall then being delivered locally. That's not really devolution at all. But so I'd agree with that. But sorry, Katie, I cut across you. Didn't mean to.
No, not a problem. I was going to agree, and I think the fundamental question of the question around intervention comes back to the market failure, and the understanding of what the actual market failure is locally is going to be driven by your regions and by your local authorities, because central government cannot understand that at the level required to have that meaningful intervention. So I'd agree with you, Dan, on that one, and with you, Nigel.
Always good to agree. I do think, I think to add to that point of market failure, I do think that maybe what's underplayed in some of our business support activity is recognising that with the right view from local practitioners or nudges from local practitioners, businesses themselves are keen to play a role in helping to develop the society, the economy, the community that they're part of. And I think, that's sometimes overlooked in some of these policies, that business support can achieve more than just helping the business. It can help the economy as well, certainly in my view. But I was going to just reach towards the end of this by asking each of the three of you sort of one or two last thoughts as to what you're hoping to see as a budget unfolds and spending reviews become clear. And I know Kieran's going to say more planners, but in addition to that, any sort of closing remarks that people want to bring to proceedings, and then we can wrap up. So I know I've not given people very much time to think of this, but at risk of picking on somebody, Kieran, why don't you try and lead us away?
Thanks, Nigel.
Yeah, apologies.
No, that's fine. No, I think what I would really like to see, in the budget particularly, or alongside the budget and the spending, I think is a refreshing and clear commitment around the industrial strategy, because I think that's so critical to setting the tone for so many of the things that we've been talking about today. And I think there's a real opportunity to see some fresh thinking on that. I think we talked earlier about potentially the role of the Industrial Strategy Council and what that could do, and we've seen some of that work done in the past, and it's never really been realised, the value of that. And I think therefore that feels at the moment to be the bit that's still sort of missing, is where are we headed to. I think it could be really useful in setting ambition, I think in sparking some ideas, and then setting the kind of platform for future devolution. And I think, to my mind, that is where I'd like to see a real sort of early kind of kickstart. I think that would make a big difference. I think on planning, as I said, it's already occupied a lot of the first 100 days. So really, probably for that, it's more about now the devil in some of the detail, as we've been talking about this afternoon. A lot of the big announcements, I feel, have probably been now made but it's going to be really how are they going to start to translate into kind of day-to-day practice. And picking up Tom's point, how do we start to get the stuff that's locked away at the moment already consented? How do we start to mobilise those projects and those schemes? And we've seen already that the Secretary of State is keen or able and willing to intervene and recover certain decisions that have been made, and I think we're going to see more of that. That will give us some clues, I think, about how this government sees itself kickstarting things. So that would be my closing thoughts.
Yeah, that's super. Thank you, Katie. Same question to you, I guess.
So I think, I think if we're looking at devolution and local growth, these are all things that have had a fair amount of attention. I think the big thing for me is looking towards your longer term approach towards investment in capital and infrastructure, because I think recognizing the importance of the industrial strategy, and I agree with you on that one, Kieran, there is also fundamentally a question about, the underinvestment in capital historically, the need to make sure that our infrastructure that supports, the business, the attractive investment proposition is developed and is there. And I'm not just talking, yes, obviously, I work for an engineering firm. We think about transport a lot, but I'm also talking about, waterways and sewage and the grid, which are all fundamentals for making sure that we are able to support this kind of productivity growth and that journey. So I think that will be the one that I'm watching out for as the budget comes through.
Thanks, Katie. And Dan.
Thanks, Nigel. I think there's probably loads of things, but 4 things that spring to mind. I think closer working with government, with local authorities, MCAs and government, particularly in policy design. We've seen, from a Barnsley perspective, we've seen the benefits of that in our Pathways to Work programme, so I would welcome that. A pathway to a future single settlement for the MCAs, linked to the local growth plans and industrial strategy, that would be welcomed. A stronger financial footing for local authorities, so a bit of a wish list this, but forgive me, but a stronger, I think it's so important that if councils are to support mayors and MCAs deliver on the local growth plans and support the government delivered industrial strategy, then there needs to be a stronger financial footing for local authorities. And linked to that, short term, let us know what's happening 25, 26, because March is coming around quick and everybody's really worried about it.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think there's no surprise in that the Institute is absolutely supportive of this idea of a strong financial foundation and some knowledge about what's coming down the track. And we continue to push for economic development to be a statutory function. So there'd be my 2 takeaways. And look, I wanted to close by really thanking Katie from Arup, Kieran from Lichfield, and Dan from Barnsley, as all 3 organisations strong supporters of the iED, for which we're very grateful, both in the long term but also for your support this afternoon. So thank you all for supporting this event, and thank you everybody for attending. We really did have a very large number of people on the call this afternoon. I hope it was useful. Don't forget to book out the 30th of October for the budget, when you'll see whether any of us had a crystal ball, and also hope to see many of you on the 6th of November in London. So yeah, thank you very much, and we'll see you all soon.